Ladies and gentlemen, this is the Nintendo GameCube. Pretty basic in design, and a surprisingly small add-on count to its name, with some third-party stuff that we'll get into later. And more specifically, this had a pretty decent lifespan to it, and a very nice number of color variations. But we're not going to focus on variations today, as that can become very expensive to do. So, instead, we're going to talk about things like accessories, like memory cards, actual add-ons, and, well, maybe even look at controllers too. So, let's get started. The Nintendo GameCube's controller library was pretty cut and dry. You had the standard wired controller, which came in a decent size and color variation, and of course you had some logo variation too, but sometimes range just didn't work as well as it should. So you would come across wireless controllers, like the Wavebird controller, which ran on two AA's, and thankfully didn't require any AA's in the adapter itself. It's pretty comfortable to use even with the battery pack, and generally you could come across it pretty easily. Of course, there are other adapters like the Game Boy Advance adapter, which allows you to actually use your Game Boy as a legitimate controller on things like the Game Boy Player, which, for what it's worth, is actually a pretty good deal, all things considered. Of course, this was generally the casual way of going about that. Now, if you were one of those who really wanted to get into it and could afford import costs, you could use the Hori Gamepad, which is actually a similar layout to the Game Boy Advance, except it's a little more comfortable to use, and the Z button's right there. With the Game Boy Advance, you would find yourself having to keep an extra controller plugged in so you could press the Z button. Of course, that's not a drawback, but honestly, this feels just as comfortable and usable as the other way around. Of course, that doesn't really stop there. You see, there are other console controllers out there too, like the Resident Evil 4 chainsaw controller, for example, which looks incredibly uncomfortable to play with. And you also have a Dance Dance Revolution mat used for the Mario mix of that game, respectively. You also have a keyboard created by Ashi, which was apparently, I want to say, Japan exclusive because of the Phantasy Star Online games. And by that I mean, well, I don't remember seeing any English releases of it to date. There is also another interesting add-on out there for the controllers in the form of the GameCube microphone and the GameCube drum, which were both for the Donkey Konga series of games. Now, outside of that, that seems all well and good, but when you really stop to think about it, it just seems all more along the lines of, those are just limited to one game, so why bother? Well, I guess you never know. I mean, generally most people don't need to really consider it. I mean, if you're going for total collection, it's best just to try and find as much as possible. Of course, there is one controller that doesn't exactly work with a home console, and that is the LodgeNet GameCube controller, which could be used for LodgeNet subscribed home hotels, I guess, and essentially they would be active as part of a complimentary deal for rooms, and if you attempted to remove them, they would not work with home consoles because they more than likely don't have the required peripheral, and also because you could call things like room service from your controller. But I'm not going to get into the detail about all that here, because that would just take too long. So, let's go ahead and move on to memory cards. Now, the GameCube's memory card collectability was forgivingly easier, but not as easy as you think. You see, Nintendo only came out with 3 sizes for the GameCube memory card selection. And these were a bit on the different side when it came to it. They went under the storage name of blocks, which I assume are just, well, that. Like, not kilobytes or megabytes like third-party editions, but we'll get into that later, but blocks. And the 3 sizes were 59 blocks, 251, and 1019. You can find all of them pretty easily on eBay, but for some reason, and I don't understand why I had this much trouble, but finding memory card 59 in box has been a little bit on the harder side now. These things are normally easy to find and come across, but usually they're yellowed out. This packaging is quite yellowed and a bit damaged, which is kind of unfortunate, but you know what? New in box is new in box, and if the box is destroyed, then so be it. But memory card 59 was the smallest size that you could actually go up to and actually find that wasn't third party. And in actual storage capacity, this would be about 4 megabytes. It's not much. You can only get 1 game on it. As a matter of fact, this one has Pokemon Coliseum on it, and that's it, because that game is 48 blocks. And overall, it's pretty basic, and rather curiously, the only one of this selection that you can actually stand up. Well, for what it's worth, I mean, finding it on GameStop's website would be several times cheaper, but it's kind of annoying, really, because nobody actually sells it like this anymore. It's kind of unfortunate. Now, the next size up from 59 is memory card 251, which is a black memory card with a label for some reason that you cannot see. But it's a little bit bigger than, okay, maybe not a little bit, like 2 times as big as 59, and I imagine, and megabyte-wise, I imagine it's a couple times bigger too, but I'm not going to get into those measurements right now because I don't have time. But long story short, you have a different packaging under your belt if you get it new in box, and it works just as well. If anything, you just get more storage space. You could probably fit about 3 big games on it or more, but really, these memory cards are made for small games, and that's pretty obvious. Of course, when it comes down to it, it's generally a pretty easy find, and you have very little trouble finding it. Alright, so the final size for the first-party GameCube line is 1019, which is the largest first-party attempt. I believe I said that. It does 4 times as much as 251, and I do not know the megabyte size of this one either. But an interesting thing about all 3 of these is that they come with these labels. And although 251 you cannot see, kind of annoying, it does help. I mean, yes, you could just write your name on it and just leave it at that, but it's kind of interesting because when it comes down to labels, Memory Card 59 had 2 different labelings for certain games. Like, there was a labeling for Pokemon Coliseum. It's somewhere on, I imagine you could probably find it on eBay if you're really careful and know where to look. And there was also one for Animal Crossing too. But going out of your way to actually find them, well, honestly, it's just more of a cosmetic thing, and you'd really have to collect them as a perfectionist more than anything else. Now, when it comes to third party, on the other hand, you have a massive selection of memory cards to choose from. Of course, going out of your way to actually get them is entirely on you. I mean, I don't know all the sizes, but I imagine it goes from 4 megabytes to a very strange margin, like 368 megs or something along those lines, but they're all over the place, and they're generally cheaper and a lot easier to find than all this. But that's pretty much all there is to memory cards. There's not much I can actually say to you there without going directly into a Wikipedia article. So, let's go ahead and move on to the last piece of this video, the add-ons. Alright everyone, to finish out the video, we're going to go ahead and talk about the last piece of information, for accessories anyway, the add-ons, which were far easier to collect than memory card 59, honestly enough. So let's go ahead and get started. First off, this one is obvious. The Game Boy player, something I've been talking about the entire video. Now, long story short, it's pretty basic. It is literally a Game Boy Advance that you can just stick under your GameCube and just start playing away. And that's basically how you install it. You basically put it in your high-speed port, and alongside running some extra software that you just run alongside it to interface, it's all good to go. And it was pretty useful. I mean, if anything, running it with a later piece that we'll be talking about honestly makes it a lot better. But honestly, it's the reason why most people generally got the Game Boy Advance link cable for the GameCube. Outside of the Legend of Zelda Link and the Four Swords, of course. So, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on. Next up is something that I'm pretty sure most people are aware of, but there were two iterations of it. I am talking about the broadband and modem adapters, which, obviously enough, were made for internet gaming, although very few games actually supported it. You would have had better luck if you would have went with a different console in that time period. But, like the Game Boy player, this is easy to install too. You just put it under serial port 1. And, well, as far as that goes, it could be said for both of these adapters that, honestly, if you're getting it, just get it as a collectible. Because, honestly, I doubt you're going to find much use for it outside of maybe Phantasy Star Online and maybe of some other games. I think Kirby Air Ride might support this too under LAN capabilities, but that's if both people have the game and this, which apparently can get kind of difficult to find. So make sure you keep that in mind if you're going to go out of your way to actually find this thing. So, moving on to our next deal. The third-party objects for the GameCube were actually pretty useful. They made it incredibly mobile, and one of them has actually been unboxed on this channel already. Yes, folks, I'm referring to the Mobile Power GC. It is a battery that goes underneath the GameCube, and if you have the Game Boy player underneath the Game Boy player, just don't try and screw it in, because you won't be able to. But it gives you an hour and a half of battery life, and it works pretty well. But there is a risk of overheating should you actually try to get it. So, if you must get this, you should probably make sure you're aware of how everything works first and not try something dangerous. Of course, there was also an Interact screen, the Mobile Monitor 5.4 inch, which basically plugged into the Mobile Power GC, and you could power it and the GameCube screen. So you can power it and the GameCube simultaneously. Of course, if you're prepared to actually go out of your way to even do this, and if you bother to buy two of these things, you can have one powering the GameCube and another powering a small flat screen TV. I've actually tested this, and somehow it has actually worked. A friend of mine actually was in the room with me at the time and was really surprised about it. But, long story short, this is probably the cheapest thing of what I just showed you because of just how easy it is to find and how little is actually known. And speaking of the monitor themselves, there was a mobile monitor created by Interact and a mobile monitor created by Intect, which I did have at one point, but you could tell they're both made for mono audio, and it was okay, but it was just there to make it as mobile as possible. But outside of that, that's pretty much it. You didn't have much you could actually do with it. Alright, now moving on to the next and final third-party piece that I'm even going to try and worry about. The GC HD. It is a GameCube HDMI adapter, which is pretty easy to use. You just plug it into the back of your GameCube and plug in an HDMI cable and you're golden. Of course, there's a slight issue. You see, folks, you have to have the DOL001 model GameCube. And honestly, you may be thinking, wait, what? DOL001 is the model number for the earlier launch edition GameCubes. And taking this out, basically this is what you'd be dealing with. You would have a digital AV out and an analog AV out. And long story short, this adapter plugs in to both of them, but only the digital port is actually used. With the analog, there is a stability issue. As you can see here, it is basically just a dummy port that you go and plug into like so, and like that, your GameCube just got an extremely lengthened lifespan. So, I suppose that really does it for add-ons. I mean, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything else that would be considered for that. Now, yes, I am aware there are other HDMI adapters. However, I have heard in the past that if you do it wrong, some adapters could actually short-circuit your system, and I thought, the risk is too great. So, for the sake of time, we decided just to only cover this for this video. So, with that out of the way, I suppose that's really it. There's not really much else I can talk about accessory-wise, and if you have any accessories that I've never heard of, please leave them in the description below. And we will see you next video. Have a good night.